Imagine what it would be like to wake up paralyzed. For me, this is my greatest fear. Being paralyzed would take away my sense of self, impact my love for independence, and prevent me from being as productive as I'd like to be. So, in this project, I explore what would happen if I was paralyzed. How would that impact my life? I've divided the project into four sections. This is the introduction, the first section. After that, I have the story section, then I answer the questions, and lastly, I have a reflection on the project. I should note that the story section was the first thing I worked on before I had done any research and just imagining my life and what it might be like. So it is kind of somber and frankly a bit depressing. But in the reflection section, I talk about how my thoughts sort of changed as I went through this project. I should also note that throughout every section, I utilize a script. I felt that the purpose of this project was to convey a message and understand what life might be like and not necessarily memorize a script, which would take a bunch of time. Also, even though many paralyzed people can have trouble with their speech, I didn't change my voice at all. I just talked normally throughout every section. And lastly, I utilized a split screen throughout the project. I felt that that would contribute to a sense of disassociation that the paralyzed person might be experiencing. And it also kind of creates boxes with the borders. And people often create boxes that are paralyzed with their internalized biases. And lastly, of course, the split screen let me show visuals as well as still showing the person and keeping the focus on the person. But that's all. So lastly, the reason I chose to do a video was because I felt that that was probably the easiest thing, that if I was a paralyzed person, or not even the easiest, but what as a paralyzed person, what I could do, because writing would be difficult, any kind of creative project would be quite difficult. And I felt that a video where I was mainly talking, although admittedly I did write a script, would probably be the thing a paralyzed person could do most independently. But with that said, here's the project starting with the story.
Is that straight? Does that look good?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Ben.
Of
Can
course.
you... yeah, I'm centered actually. Okay.
Okay.
That's all.
Great. Thank you.
Life is a lot like moving through water now. I used to drive weekly to see my friends, and now I have to wait for the rare moments where they can come to see me. Instead, I do video calls with them, but it's not really the same as in person connection. My everyday life is dependent on others now. I used to be the independent one, capable of getting more done in a day than anyone I knew, and now every motion I take in my day is completely dependent on the actions and the help of others. I used to love walks. Now, every bump on the sidewalk reminds me I've lost the freedom of my legs. The world wasn't built for someone like me. When I go outside, people stare at me rather than smile like they used to as I traverse through the neighborhood that I've lived in for 17 years. I had so many dreams, and now I just find myself constantly downsizing my ambitions. Now I just want to live a good life, and even that can seem so hard. I can't hold my partner's hand or carry her around anymore. I never wanted an equal give and take in a relationship, but now I take far more than I give. There's still things I can do that I enjoy, but they've changed. I used to love writing every day. The feeling of the keyboard as my fingers moved across it, and the connection that I had between immediately having a thought and immediately putting it to page. Now I can't write. I have to verbalize my thoughts. If I make a mistake, it's so much harder to go back and correct it. I don't love writing anymore, but it's one of the few things that I still feel capable of doing in my formerly able body. I thought technology was annoying before I was disabled, but now my entire life depends on it functioning, and it's kind of rare that a day goes by where something doesn't go wrong. A simple setback like the computer not turning on would have been a simple fix before, but now it can set me back hours. I've always been energetic, and I would often record videos to myself like I am now. And in those videos, I would move around, I would dance, I would show what I was looking at. And now the video is just static and it's this box. And I had to get help setting it up. I can't change your perspective, and I can't dance anymore. and it just feels a lot more soulless. Yeah, can you just go down a little bit to the next page? Yeah, cool. Thank you. Okay, of course. My life overall is much harder now, and it's hard to downsize everything I've wanted and worked for. There are moments that make me happy though. I find a lot of satisfaction in the problem solving of learning to live in this new world I find myself in. There's so much more satisfaction in an accomplishment knowing the challenges I overcame to get there. Something like getting down the stairs. I never felt validated by that before, but when I do it now, it really makes me feel like I accomplished something big, and it makes me proud of myself. And I'm not fully there yet on being good at looking at those wins I have in the day and making them into big things, but I'm working on it, and I'm trying to appreciate what functionality and abilities I still do have, rather than focusing on what I've lost. Um, but that's my story. Thank you. If I was paralyzed, the first thing I would need to do is seek out medical advice and doctors that could help me. This would probably take a really long time. A lot of time there's wait lists for these kinds of things, and you have to find their resources. So this would probably be one of the hardest periods of being paralyzed. The other things I would first do is I would also look for rehabilitation and other resources, and just begin acquiring a list of resources. But in the meantime, there would be a lot of things I would also just have to adjust in my life. And the first of those is just reevaluating my life and restructuring all these things that I would have to do. And the list would be extremely long. Um, I would also have to assess the impact on my activities of daily living, the ADL, things like getting out of bed, getting dressed, cleaning myself, eating. Those would all be greatly impaired if I was paralyzed and would require assistance. I would also have to communicate about my needs. That's something I would have to get a lot better at. And beyond that, my room is upstairs, the room I'm in right now, so I would have to probably move downstairs. Beyond that, other things I would need to do, reconsider my future. Like, I'm in college right now, I'm taking this class, but if I was paralyzed, that would take up a bunch of my time. It would take up a bunch of my family members' time. And so I think I would at least temporarily have to drop out of college, or if I were to go back to college, just do online classes maybe. And maybe the hardest thing is I would just have to adjust my dreams, my career, like, and be realistic, or maybe not realistic, but just reassess what can I actually do, and what do I want to do with my life now that I am paralyzed. Other things I could do: reach out to other people who are recently paralyzed or have been paralyzed for advice and support. And I think a really big one for me, beyond all these changes I would have to make in my life, is taking care of myself to the best that I could. So besides getting software and learning to use like voice activated computers and navigating that, I would want to look for online communities where I felt included. Stuff related to being paralyzed, like r/spinal cord injuries, but also just things like Discord and other communities I could go into. I would also maybe look into in-person meetups. Are there other paralyzed people I can meet up with to connect with, so I'm not just locked in my room all the time? And I would also need to communicate with the people close to me. So just trying to develop relationships and placing a lot of value on communication. And I also think it's important that I not only have the in-person communities that I can try and find, but also those online ones, like for my hobbies. So things like chess or Settlers of Catan or writing. I don't think that because I'm paralyzed I should give those things up. I just might need to adjust my goals for them. But I think it would be important to have communities that aren't just for paralyzed people, just for stuff that I like. As far as what resources are out there to help me, I actually found quite a lot, so that's good as a paralyzed person. The first big one is the Administration for Community Living. It stands for ACL. It's a federal agency that supports aging and disabled individuals, and they have a big partnership with the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. And essentially, it's a one-stop shop for people that are paralyzed. They've got a bunch of resources. They have an extensive list of them by type that you can filter. They've also got phone numbers, emails you can contact, advice for various questions and problem areas. They have a 392-page paralysis resource guide, and they also have a virtual support group. So the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation was a really, really great resource that I found. Beyond that, other resources I would go for probably Social Security. The website Disability Benefits Help has categorizations by city for how to apply for Social Security. So I would go there and probably apply for that. As far as local resources, I would reach out to the Disability and Aging Resource Center in my city. There actually is one. It's called the Tarrant County Aging and Disability Resource Center. So I would definitely reach out to them. And beyond that, again, focusing on my emotional and mental needs as well, I would look into online therapy. There's websites for that, things like Talkspace, things like Seven Cups. And I would try and find a therapist who was familiar with people that had mobility related issues. Of course, the challenge with all of this resource stuff is the financial strain it would take on my family and myself. And then the last resource that could be available for me is just taking comfort in the legislation that's available. Besides the ADA, you have the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and also the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. So there's legislation that supports me, to prevent discrimination that I might face. As far as resources that weren't available, I tried to find in-person meetups for paralyzed people in my city, and I couldn't find any. I guess that makes sense because moving around as a paralyzed person is very difficult, but I think that would be a good thing to exist, and it doesn't currently. Another big problem, and this kind of relates to financial strain, is movement in and out of a car. Cars are so essential in the infrastructure we have nowadays, but I can't drive anymore. And getting in and out of a car and having a car that worked for someone that's in a wheelchair would be a huge financial strain. And beyond that, I would have a lot of trouble finding a job I could work. There are websites to find jobs for disabled people, but the textbook, the Werger and Wilbur's textbook, mentions that half of disabled people are unemployed in the US, more than half, and a fourth of them live below the poverty line. So there are a lot of resources for me if I was paralyzed, but there's also a lot of big challenges, and there are some areas that kind of lack in regards to resources for paralyzed people. To fill the gap, I would just continually put in effort and research to try and expand resource list, send emails, get in contact with researchers, do whatever I could to just continually make sure I'm educating myself. And beyond that, I could reach out to nonprofits and I could do advocacy. That's a really important part. Platforms like YouTube, there's so many social medias out there, and Substack for writers, places I can go to share my story. And I think that would be something I would really try to do if I was paralyzed. Beyond that, I would look for groups I could join to advocate for my rights and increase representation. And lastly, I can just take inspiration for advocacy things I can do, such as the Capitol Crawl and the 504 sit-in demonstrations that got the ADA passed and signed into law. Agencies I would look into for assistance, besides the previously mentioned Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation and ACL, include the National Spinal Cord Injury Association, NSCIA. They have an extensive list of products and resources by problem area and state. So for example, mobility issues, you can sort through that on the website and see a huge list of products that could help you with that. I would also go to ada.gov. That has a list of legal rights and a place to file complaints if you feel like you're being discriminated against for your disability. And they also have an informational phone line, so someone I can talk to. And lastly, for trying to get a job as someone that was paralyzed, there's abilityjobs.com and there's also careercircle.com. So there are actually job websites that are specific to people that are disabled. So although it would still be very difficult for me to get a job, especially as a paralyzed person, there's still resources out there, and I could take full use of them. It's kind of hard to think of ways that I wouldn't be treated differently for having a disability. The main one that comes to mind is it would probably just be a lot harder to make friends. I mean, it can already be kind of hard to make friends, but if I was in a wheelchair or paralyzed, I think it would be really hard to find people that I guess were okay with that and didn't see it as a sacrifice to be friends with someone that was in a wheelchair. Another big problem would be people seeing me for my labels and my disability rather than who I am, choosing my the things I struggle with over who I am as a person. This kind of gets into the medical model where people are seen as needing to be cured and that they should be pitied, rather than the social model, which says society needs to change. The Amy's story from the textbook I thought was kind of relevant to this question, where she talks about how she was walking around with a cane and she tried to go into her classroom at the start of the semester, and this was in high school, and her teacher said that the special ed room was down the hall, and that really stuck with me because, I mean, that's just such a great example of the kind of discrimination people can face for being disabled, and how just because Amy had some mobility issues, that's all her teacher saw her for. I also think that another way I could be affected is through inspiration porn. The TED Talk by Stella Young talks about this concept, where just by existing, just by doing things that aren't impressive at all, people are like, wow, that's so impressive, and it's amazing that you can like get up out of bed and that you haven't like killed yourself. So inspiration porn, I think, would be a really big problem and something I would experience, especially the pity part of it. And the last thing I think I could do, something to give kind of some actions to this and inspire a bit of hope, is the three-step process outlined by Jo Copson in her TED Talk, Am I Disabled? So she talked about her experience of looking into disability and like living with it. And she outlined 3 steps, the first of which is to educate, which primarily focuses on listening to people's stories and learning about your disability as well as other disabilities. The second step is to communicate with other people, with yourself, and to fight that the biases you have against yourself, like, wow, I'm a terrible person because I'm disabled, to fight against that. So second step, communicate. And lastly, to advocate for yourself and for others. So the 3 steps, I think, would be educate, communicate, and advocate, as suggested by Jo Copson. Being disabled would have a huge effect on my identities. Being productive is a huge part of how I view myself and my ability to get things done. And I would really have to change how much I valued that and learn to appreciate other things about myself. It would be a lot of work too to get to the point where I felt like I could still live just as of a fulfilling and valued life before I was paralyzed. I think comparison would be a really big problem. And Alice Wan kind of talks about this, and she talked about how she's had a lot of struggle with self-loathing and all these internalized biases she had, and just believing she was a bad person and that her life wasn't necessarily worth living, which isn't true. So I think that would also be something that would be impacted in my identity, is just how much self-loathing I would potentially have to fight with. Another problem mentioned by R.D. McWilliams, who was this disabled speaker we watched a video from, was how difficult it would be to relax. Um, the mental torment of just wondering, what are other people thinking about me? Do I need to be on edge? Even as a paralyzed person, I think that would be a really, really big problem. And he also talked about how you could often get angry at your lack of ability, and it just had to be something you could learn to accept. And I think that would be really hard. So that would also impact my identity. But I think that it's not all hopeless. I think I would have to learn the importance of acceptance and focus on the positives, the things I could still do. Things like, hey, there's infrastructure with curb cuts, and look at this, all these buildings that have elevators for me. And look at the people that do care, the people that like don't compliment me for the fact that I got up, but like things about my personality and what I can still do, focusing on what I can still do rather than all the things that I can't. And just to end this, I want to give a quote from, again, the Joe Copson video. And that quote is that living with disability is often two steps forward and one step back. And I think that is something that anyone that is disabled has to realize and learn to accept. But that's all. Like a super crip, I have magically overcome and been cured of my disability. But this was pretend, and people with disabilities don't have the option to magic away their disability like I have here. In general, I would say this project has made me realize that I'm actually very scared of becoming disabled. I really value my independence. My life revolves around it. And something as simple as this assignment would have been an overwhelming task if I was paralyzed. Making anything requires a bunch of mobility, and I imagine it would have taken me at least 3 times longer than if I was able bodied to make this. And I also would have required the support of other people. And I couldn't shake this sense that if I was paralyzed, I would never have been able to make something like this, and I would just constantly be thinking about how much better something I could have made would be if I wasn't paralyzed. And I think that is something that would be really hard. Um, I wouldn't have been able to edit the video, and I was just scared in general by the idea of how much harder life would be as a paralyzed person. I think a big part of this fear comes from who I was before I was paralyzed, and I feel like that would happen a lot. That comparison, and just the capacity I had before I was paralyzed. Well, I used to be able to do this, and it's so awful that I can't do it now. And it would be really hard to accept the fact that I couldn't get back to that, and this was the new norm, and I was going to have to learn to live with it. So doing this project made me realize how much value I place on myself to be a hard worker and to get a lot of stuff done. Kind of as you saw in the No Right to Be Idle book, society really values people for their ability to be productive, at least outside of friends and family. But even in that book, you saw friends and family often valued other people for their productivity. As an able-bodied person, I'm lucky to experience a world where I'm valued beyond my ability to be productive. But I think that's something that is a privilege, and I hadn't really thought about that being a privilege before. Because if I was disabled and I wasn't capable of working, I think that would be such a roadblock for people. And so I think it is a privilege to be able to say I'm valued for things beyond what I can do. I also do think that my career aspirations still would work if I was paralyzed. It would just be a lot harder. I want to be a counselor, and I could get my counseling degree online. I mean, it would be very hard, and I would have to do an extended program for sure, but I think I could probably still do it. And I think I would also probably have to provide teletherapy, even though I would prefer providing in-person counseling, just because moving would be so difficult. I also think I would probably end up specializing in counseling people with disabilities and especially paralysis that were paralyzed like me. Um, Outside of career, though, I think that writing and sharing my story would become a much larger part of my life. And although the writing would have to be done through largely eye tracking and vocal software, which would be slow and rather cumbersome, especially if I made a mistake, I think it would be important to continue every day to try and do things independently and things I was interested in, because one small difference or hiccup can require someone else's assistance in my daily requirements. So having things where messing up uh, isn't a problem, I think would be really important. And beyond my career and personal life, spaces where I could pass as a non-disabled person, I think would also be important. Kind of like what I was talking about having a chess community I was a part of, where it wasn't just disabled people. I was like fitting in. I think the internet gives paralyzed people a really great opportunity, and other disabled people who do want to pass and don't want to feel this pressure of being judged by their visible disability constantly. The internet gives them a safe space to explore what that might be like, as far as beyond spaces, I can definitely say I was surprised by all the resources out there and how much support I did find on the internet. I guess I thought that disabled people were kind of written off in a lot of ways, but there's actually a lot of resources out there. You know, the governmental agency, AALC, you've got a lot of legislation, ADA, things like that. And I was really just in general expecting there to be more gaps in support. And really, there weren't many gaps I could find. And I'm sure if I was actually paralyzed, I would have had an easier time finding those gaps. But in general, I was happily surprised by how many resources were out there for paralyzed people and just disabled people in general. Um, so I would guess I would say that if there is one takeaway I have had from all of this, and something that I would share, it's that even if you are disabled and things are going to be harder for you in your life, and you know your day to day is going to be a lot more tiring and things like that, that I think there's still a lot of hope out there. And obviously, I'm saying that as an able-bodied person and someone who isn't paralyzed, but I think there is a lot of hope in a lot of resources and organizations and even the government. And friends and family, right? There's all these supports out there, and I didn't realize how many there were until I did this project. And so I would say to find optimism in that and take hope in that, and above all, to not give up, because every life is worth living. And I guess that's all. So thank you.